I feel like I'm in a sweatshop right now. Morning lectures back to back. That's unsafe working conditions for me. First, before I do though, what I wanted to show you when I was putting my flash drive in with this PowerPoint, I've got a few pictures that relate to the last talk that I got. That's literally the bridge to nowhere in the Virgin Islands. This is looking the, oops. Oh, that's where you can get the t-shirts. There was another picture in there that just didn't work. Also, on the same little thing I found when I was talking about Tragedy of the Commons in Zimbabwe, I don't have the new one is cool and it's on the internet. I don't have that on here, but I have an old one that makes part of the point. And go ahead. So this is a satellite image of the overall country, and you can see brown and green areas. Here we put in the political jurisdictions over them, and when you get the small regions like this, they're communal farming land. When you get larger chunks, that's the commercial farms. And you see the big difference between the green and the brown overlapping the property rights jurisdictions almost perfectly. One more zooms in on it, and you can see the little differences there. I think these are pretty compelling pictures, but I think when you look at the ones on the internet that actually shows you the change as land reform's happening, it's much more dramatic. Okay, if we can switch to the Sweatshops PowerPoint now, we'll be good to go. So today, this lecture, what I want to talk to you about is third world sweatshops and their effect on living standards. There, what you're seeing there, by the way, is a different slide. One of my Parade magazine published a list of the world's 20 worst dictators. And go ahead, just switch to the other PowerPoint. The same grad student I did the work with on testing the P.T. Barrow hypothesis calls me up and he goes, you know, I bet all of those SOBs get aid. So we took a look and saw how much OECD aid and how much USAID aid they've all gotten since they've been in power. And 19 of the 20 received aid from the United States, and 20 of the 20 received aid from the OECD countries, and sometimes quite significant. That's what that was. All right, so now my new topic, this lecture, sweatshop wages and third world workers, are the jobs worth the sweat? So first, put a kind of human picture on it, because I am going to go into show you more numbers on this in a few graphs. This is a picture inside of a sweatshop. These places are not, by our standards, pleasant places to work. You can see that they're crowded in. There's a number of sewing machines fairly close together. They have their shirts off, so I assume that it is hot. It's a little bit blurry, but you can see that there's a fan here, at least. But you might also notice something else about it.
It's not running.
You can see the blades, so it's not running. Whether it's broke or not, I don't know. This particular one, you can also see a fire extinguisher on the wall, so there's some consciousness of safety there, but there's others that aren't. These are very unpleasant places to work for the most part. But we also have to keep in mind that what's relevant isn't our standard, it's what's the available alternatives to them. And I feel a little bit like Tony up here. I'm like calling strikes. No, I didn't mean that. I was just doing the strike. That's okay, though. Often the available alternatives are much, much worse. So subsistence agriculture, if you've been to many third world countries, you've probably often seen this, people collecting wood, bringing it back to use for fuel themselves, or to sell, and often it's going onto common land and chopping down the trees and bringing them back for there, so you get some deforestation happening in an inefficient way. It can be even worse than this. Destitution, begging, starvation. When your alternative is something like that, the sweatshop job, although bad by our standards, can be much better compared to theirs. So let's start by defining what I mean when I say a sweatshop. Because sweatshop is one of these terms that people throw around a lot, but it's kind of hard to define. I'm talking about a place that has very low wages by US standards. So sometimes just paying $1 a day, sometimes paying even less than that. And a place that has what we call kind of poor working conditions. Now, poor working conditions could be very long hours, unhealthy conditions, safety risks where you might get injured on the job. Other things that pop into this, sometimes you find no bathroom breaks are allowed, no lunch break are allowed. Verbal abuse from the boss. Maybe even sometimes physical abuse while on the job. One thing that I am not talking about when I talk about sweatshops are places where the workers are literally coerced into working there. So I'm not talking about a situation of slave labor or a situation where either the government or a private person can, with the threat of violence, say you must work at this firm. I'm talking about sweatshops as places where workers choose to work there. Admittedly, from a very bad set of alternatives. But where just a new option has been offered to them and they choose to work at it rather than their alternatives. So I'm not talking about slave labor places. Yes?
What about instances of sort of fraudulent practices on the part of the employer, such as not consistently paying wages and things of that nature, which seems to be somewhat of an aggression in itself? If they're in such a destitute state, do they really have the option of like just quitting because they haven't been paid because the employer knows that they can get away with it for a period of time?
I'm not really. I wouldn't ever defend that practice, period. In practice and sorting it out, some of these sweatshops that I'll end up going into later may have periodically done that and I don't know about it. But it's hard for them to do it systematically to their employees for a long time because they cease to be employees. So I think any individual instance of it is a problem. But I think it's a reason for employees to stop working for the firm, not necessarily a reason for us to not buy its products. But I'll get into that a little bit more later. But that's a good question. In fact, it's one I haven't been asked on this before, which is unusual because I've given this talk a lot of times.
A friend of mine actually worked at a sweatshop in New York City. She wasn't getting paid for a little while.
For a little while, yeah. All right. So that's what type of sweatshop I'm talking about. And the key here is choice. Workers choose to work there, admittedly from the bad alternatives. That's what brings us into economics. And economists, fairly widely across the political spectrum even, have taken a gains from trade to approach to this. Basically, workers choose to work there because it's better than their alternatives. Therefore, they're gaining from the trade. Employers who make money off this obviously gain from the trade because they choose to employ the workers. And guys from like on the left, like Paul Krugman even, at one point defended sweatshops in one of his columns. And of course, guys like Walter Williams have done it as well. So there's a fairly wide chunk of economists that have taken this approach. But often it hasn't had a lot of data behind it. It's just kind of been the casual story about it. Did we jump twice? No, come back. Yeah. One more. There we go. Cool. So talking about these alternatives, I gave you a few pictures before. Sometimes economists have kind of gave casual definitions of what the alternatives are. So they talk about in Cambodia where hundreds of people scavenge for plastic bags, metal cans, and bits of food and trash dumps, and they start talking about one particular person there who earns 75 cents a day for her efforts. And it says for her, the idea of being exploited in a garment factory, working only 6 days a week inside, instead of 7 days a week in the broiling sun for up to $2 is a dream. Now, of course, we want that dream to improve. We want them to have better alternatives than this. But we have to be very careful that as we agitate to improve that dream and get them better alternatives, we don't, in the meantime, take away the best of the few options that they have. And at first, when I read this, my first comparison was $2 a day to 75 cents a day. As the economist, I went right at the number. Clearly, $2 a day job looks preferable. As I've done sweatshops more and talked more and more to people about this, there's a different part of this quote that stands out to me more now. Inside instead of outside. A lot of people take that as a big improvement in working conditions, especially in very poor places. And this came up in conversation one time. This is from Guatemala, about an hour outside of Antigua, just bordering on some of the highlands area. When I go on trips abroad, usually for work, I also usually sneak in bagging some mountains, and there were a couple of cool volcanoes here I wanted to climb. So when I was coming down to get on at the bottom slopes of the volcano, people had farming and other things that they were doing. As coming off, and I had a guide with me on this one, not because the climb was particularly difficult, but because the cost of labor was cheap, and it included transport and food and tents and other things I didn't want to pack in my bags. As we were coming off the mountain, we were talking as we go through the field, and I saw a man working in the field, and he was literally doing the work of an ox. He had a cross piece on his shoulders, and he had two giant logs, one on either shoulder, being dragged behind him as he pulled it down off the mountain that he had just chopped down. And I didn't end up taking a picture of him. I did take a picture. You can't really tell their age. These are two younger kids who have piles of the chopped up wood on their back. But I struck up a conversation with the guide on this. I said, what does somebody earn doing this? And he said, oh, not very much, and he told me. And I said, well, what about workers in garment factories here? I didn't use the word sweatshops, but garment factories work in textile. He says, oh, it varies. I'm like, well, someone not in Guatemala City, not in Antigua, outside of the two biggest cities, entry-level worker. He says, oh, I don't know. And we went back and forth a little, and finally he gave me a figure in quetzales, and what it worked out to was like the equivalent of 2 beers per day. This is how I do foreign currency calculations usually. Once I get there, I'll buy some alcohol and I figure out how much that costs in local currencies, and everything else I just translate into beers then. I'm like, oh, do I like that sweater? Well, do I like it more than 10 beers? As a result, I don't bring home many souvenirs. So anyway, I asked him, it was just a couple beers, but his response before I even said anything was, but they're inside, not outside like him. Like that was an important part too. He didn't know how I feel about sweatshops and other things, but he seemed that was important to point out. And I heard this resonate with a lot of other workers there before too, that there's a change in working conditions simply by moving from to inside from outside that matters to them in terms of their standard of living. One thing to keep in mind with this too, this is another picture from same place a couple of years later when I was there doing another volcano there. These are two kids out working in the fields. Check out it's kind of hard to tell their exact age, but if you take a look, they're almost certainly not 12 years old or older. They're probably, I don't know, it's hard to tell sometimes. My guess was going to be 9 years old or so. And they're out there working in the fields. And often one of the objections we get with sweatshops is child labor. Children are working there, it's therefore bad. And in an ideal world, the children would be in school learning, so they'll be more productive later. But often the alternative there, if when they lose that sweatshop job, it's not that they go to school, they end up in a worse informal sector. Here in Guatemala, this was during a weekday, a time when the kids should have been in school. They're out working in their field. So the question about education and building human capital, part of that occurs on the job. They're not building very much of it working out there. They're likely to be dragging the log later in their life, like the other guy I saw. If they're in the factory, they're at least building some skills there that might translate into a better factory job for them later as those expand. So we have to be very careful. And sometimes the opportunities for children are even worse. The Oxfam, the British charity, pointed out Bangladesh, a factory was pressured into firing its child employees. And what they found, the result of that was that, quote, thousands of children became prostitutes or starved. Clearly a much worse alternative than working in the sweatshop. So we have to be really careful about doing things that will jeopardize the jobs they have. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try to make the jobs better. But it means we have to think about what could jeopardize those. Which brings us back to figuring out, once we know gains from trade, what determines the level of the mix of compensation for workers. So, who wants to be my sweatshop owner here? You're my sweatshop owner. Andy's smiling too. You're my sweatshop owner, and your friend next to you can be your sweatshop employee. Let's say that he produces the equivalent of $1 of revenue for you per hour. What's the amount, the maximum amount you're willing to pay him? His marginal revenue product. You're speaking in economics. That's fine. For all of the humans in the room, if he produces $1 an hour for you, how much are you willing to pay him? What's his marginal revenue product? Well, the most you're willing to pay him would be $1 an hour. If you had to pay him $1.50 per hour, what would you do?
No, I wouldn't. I'd fire him. You'd
fire him, right? And then you'd leave him in the street too. I know you. You'd say he got himself there. The point, though, is if he produces $1 an hour for you of value, you'll never pay him more than that, because it's going to cost you money every hour he works for you. So, by the way, good here, how to remain not unemployed. Make sure your marginal revenue product's higher than your wage. Create value who's employing you more than what they're paying you. Then you won't get unemployed. Anyway, that's the most. Of course, what would you like to pay him? Nothing. Zero. You'd like to pay him nothing. So now we've got these two levels. We know our two bounds. Upper bound is going to be the most you would be willing to pay him is his marginal revenue product of the $1 an hour he creates for you. What you'd like to pay him is nothing. Will you work for him for nothing? No. What's the least he could pay you that would make you be willing to work for him? You don't need to give me a figure. Give me an idea here. Oh, okay, something above nothing. Specific. Who has a part-time job here? You do. Where do you work?
I work for a law firm.
You work for a law firm. Why do you work for that law firm?
Because they're awesome.
Because they're awesome.
No, it's a good job. I get experience, and it's enough to feed me and buy me beers and, you know, all the other extras that I want. Well, I would like more, obviously, but it's enough to get me by comfortably.
Would you,
my rent.
if another law firm wanted you to pay you twice as much, would you leave maybe?
Oh, you know what? Maybe.
Maybe. 3 times?
That's getting there.
That's getting there. Basically, what's going to limit how little I can pay somebody is going to be how good their next available alternative is. Or in economics speak, what's your opportunity cost? So, if I want to offer you nothing, you're going to stay at your law firm and be happy where you are. If I offer you something better than what they're offering you, all things considered, then you'll move. So that's our upper and lower bound, basically. The upper bound is the amount you contribute to a firm's profit. The lower bound is what's your next available alternative. That's an actual pay then is in a bargaining range that has to fall in between there. In most situations, these bounds get very tight together. Because quite often, the amount of revenue you can produce for one firm is closely related to the amount of revenue you could produce for another firm. That means your opportunity cost of working at one firm is not working at the other where you produce the same amount of value. As they compete for your services by bidding you away, or other people like you away, it pushes the wages pretty close to your marginal revenue product. That's particularly true in low-skill jobs. So when you think about very high-skill jobs, quite often you develop human capital, skills for that job that are very job-specific. Just that one thing that you do very well. And maybe even firm-specific because you have institutional knowledge of the larger firm. Like, have any of you worked at a big company, like more than 100 employees or so? A few people. Have you ever noticed a guy around who's like, you're like, this guy would never make it anywhere else in the world, but he actually knows how to get things done in this place? Those people have a lot of firm-specific human capital. For them, there might be a big gap between next best alternative and the amount of revenue that they can produce for that specific firm. But now think lower-skilled jobs. Like think about someone working at McDonald's. How firm-specific is that human capital? Not very. You'd have to have a little bit of retraining. You can do just as much for Burger King. There, you're much tighter in that bound. So jobs like sweatshop jobs of sewing and such quite often tend to be those jobs where the bounds are very tight together. So a lot of this game, then, if we want to raise their compensation, we need to raise the things on both bounds, but in particular that upper bound, the revenue that they can create for the firm, we need to do things to make the worker more productive. As they become more productive, they can get higher wages. As they can get higher wages, they can get higher wages from other people, and that'll pull the lower bound up against it again. The other thing we can look to do, and I think this is more limited in scope, is look to raise that lower bound, look to raise their opportunity cost. Generally, I think their opportunity cost mostly rises when you increase their marginal revenue product, but there could be cases that I could imagine in particular situations in countries where there's a big gap between their upper and lower bound. Say a situation where there's only one factory in town, and you can create revenue for that firm, or you can do subsistence farming. There you might have more of a bargaining range of amount of revenue you could create compared to your opportunity cost. So we'd look at policies then that would do things that would raise your lower bound to make that firm pay you more of the revenue product that you create for them. That's where the game's got to be, though. This is where wage determination happens, whether it's in the United States or in the third world. So if we want sweatshop jobs to be better, we fundamentally have to address these two bounds. Anything that tries to change sweatshop pay without addressing these two bounds risks taking those jobs that people are already in and having employers just decide, I'm going to fire you, go in the street. And if we do that, we force them into the worst alternatives. The next question above these, and I've debated this with human rights activists before. And one of the things that I was actually kind of shocked the last time I debated it, the woman I was debating actually said fairly early on, I'll admit sweatshop jobs pay more than alternatives. I kind of said, okay, we're done. But it was a point that I really tried to make to the audience a lot in that situation, that this is a big admission and a huge point. It's amazing that we agree on this, because I bet you most of the students in the audience who are anti-sweatshop wouldn't have thought that. But a lot of people recognize that these jobs, even opponents of sweatshops, pay more, but they'll say, sure, they pay more, but the working conditions, it's the working conditions we got to deal with. We need to make the jobs safer, healthier, fewer hours, etc. Well, that's part of the mix of compensation. So your overall level of compensation is not just your wages. It's your wages plus all those other things. So like, you hesitated actually when I said, well, if I paid you double, would you leave that law firm? Presumably it's because you were thinking about other things that are part of your compensation of working there that you like.
Yeah, it kind of goes in with the sweatshop. It's the opposite. I mean, it's just such a great working environment. I've worked in places where the people I work with are just almost unbearable, where my job is so miserable I just hate because of the people I work with. But the environment, when I go in, it's always really nice. It's a small office. We go out for lunches quite often. It's just the environment that is awesome. And I know a lot of other law firms are not so pleasant to work in. I mean, it's one to do with the type of law we practice. I mean, I couldn't work in a family law firm. It's just too stressful. Yeah. So it does. There's a lot to do.
Yeah, so non-monetary compensation is important. In this case, you're talking about collegiality of your colleagues and stuff. In the sweatshop case, we might say not being verbally abusive, allowing bathroom breaks, not slapping your employees, stuff like that. That's a form of compensation that you'd like. That's part of your mix of compensation. In fact, longer breaks, more days off, maybe even health care or some other forms of benefits. These, when an employer can provide them costlessly to you, they already have an incentive to give them to you. To the extent that they can make it a better working environment for you so you're a happier worker, they don't have to pay you as much. Basically, your opportunity cost, they know that she's not going to leave if I come and offer her $2 an hour more. And it's not costing the employer anything to do it. They'll give you those things. Then the next part is, how much of this other compensation will they give you when it decreases their profits? So will they buy health care for you? So in some sense, safe and working environment in some sweatshops actually means more productive employees. If your guys aren't chopping off their fingers, they can be more productive sewing for you. At the same time, in many cases, it's not very costly to replace workers in these situations, so maybe they don't care that much revenue-wise whether you chop off your fingers or not. You presumably do care whether you chop off your fingers. So if it's something that costs the employer money to give you, that doesn't also impact his profits, that doesn't increase his profits, that it decreases his overall profits, that's part of the mix of compensation. So how much do we give you in wages? How much do we give you in health, safety, and other benefits? Does an employer, you're my sweatshop employer, do you particularly care? Let's say you're going to compensate him 90 cents an hour. Do you particularly care whether you give him 45 cents an hour in health and safety, and 45 in pay, or 90 in pay and no health and safety? No, you don't care. It's just off your bottom line, right? It's the amount of money that you have to spend to get him to work there. Employers, for the most part, to the extent that it doesn't impact their profits at all, they don't care about how that compensation's mixed. They care about the total level. It can't be above your marginal revenue product, in that case the dollar per hour. But how it's divided up, they really don't care about. You are his worker. Do you care? Do I care? If, let's say I give you 90 cents an hour, but there's a pretty strong probability you chop off your finger. Or I give you like 80 cents an hour in pay, and I make it pretty unlikely you're going to chop off your finger. You might choose the 80 cents. There might be somebody else out there among you who says, I'd rather have the 90 cents and I'll be careful. The point, though, is generally, you care, the employee, you care about that mix. Well, if the employer doesn't care, and you do care, what does an employer have an incentive to do?
Adjust it so that it's how you want it.
Adjust it so it's kind of how you, the worker, wants it. Because if it's not how you want it, and they're bidding to get you from somebody else, that means they have to pay higher total compensation, because the mix is wrong. Basically, $1 of cost to them isn't $1 of benefit to you. If they can remix that package so that the $1 of cost to them equals $1 of benefit to you, they can offer you less total. So the mix, how it's divided up inside, is largely driven by employee preferences. Yeah?
But wouldn't it mean with the 80 cents payment and then the whatever 10 cents compensation for being careful, wouldn't the employer want to care about how he's spending his money in the mix of compensation? Because if, say, his employee does end up cutting off his finger, he's not as efficient then after at his job.
Yeah, so to the extent that there are these type, and I was kind of trying to, I wasn't maybe very clear about it, what I was trying to do at the beginning is say, to the extent that there are health and safety improvements where they do get a feedback on it, like it does increase their profitability by making sure you don't chop your fingers off, they'll have an incentive to put that into the mix of compensation. So in terms of like minimum health and safety standards, they want to be doing that. They have a profit incentive to do it, as you point out. In many cases in these countries, for the entry-level sweatshop job, it doesn't take very much human capital to get in there, and there's a surplus of labor that's essentially underemployed in the country. So if one of your workers comes in and chops off his finger, what do? Fire him and hire another one. In that case, you probably don't care. But in some cases you do, just as you point out, because it'll make you more profitable for your workers to be. So in those cases that you don't care, though, the only thing then, so this is even less health and safety than what the minimum you'd pointed out would be, it's going to be driven mostly by employee preferences. Now, it's not going to be perfectly because, if it's a firm that employs a bunch of workers, you don't literally ask them all, what's your mix, what's your mix, what's your mix. But on average, you need to target it for what the general population wants for the mix to come and work for the firm. That means those people in the West who complain and say, no, I understand they pay more, but I want to change the mix of compensation. What they're saying is, I, who am not working in that job and I'm sitting here, is saying, I know best for what your preferences would be for how your compensation should come from your employer. I think that takes a tremendous amount of conceit. They have to recognize when they say that they're advocating moving the mix of compensation away from what people desired. To me, there's a strong presumption that that mix is what they desired. What we're concerned about then is the level. As the level goes up, you'll get more health and safety, in particular because if you think about it, when you're very, very poor, would you like to buy lots of health and safety? Health and safety is a normal good. As your income rises, you'll buy more of it. So at first, while you're very poor, you're taking everything you can in monetary income because you need to feed your family, shelter your family, and buy some clothes. As it starts going up, then you start buying more health and safety and taking less in wages. And as it keeps going up after that, you start buying comfort and collegial environment and nice office seats, a nice view from your office, whatever. But these things tend to go together. So really, the key to getting these better other forms of compensation there is do things that start raising the level and then let the workers decide for themselves what their trade-offs still have to be. But if you go in and violently say, through a trade agreement, say, we won't trade with the country unless they mandate X for safety standards, you're most likely changing the package of compensation for the workers and changing it in a way that the employee themselves doesn't like. The other alternative, of course, is that your legislation necessarily pushes the cost of employing them higher than their marginal revenue, and they end up leaving and getting unemployed of it. So either case, though, you're harming the worker. Yeah?
Employers won't pay above marginal revenue. That is, they won't pay above more than what a worker craves.
Yes.
What if you create a different incentive for the employer to separate, per se, the benefits of better safety, work conditions, and their profits? So, I mean, an analogy I would say, I know law, right? So, theory of law, there's this idea that social movements use law not as an end, but as a means. So, social movements can use the courts to not actually win, their social movement values, but to, publicize their event or some kind of that. So maybe in the same way people who protest sweatshops know that actually sweatshops actually are good, for the workers as, as an end. They do pay more, rather than domestic, competition. But they're still going to put pressure on those international corporations because international corporations have, other interests that they can use as incentives, public face value. So by, leveraging, legislation or whatever, whether or not it passes,
Yeah,
use
okay.
that as a means.
So the idea here is that if the sweatshop movement may recognize that these jobs are better than the current alternatives, but by putting pressure on them, you create pressure for the companies to make these alternatives even better, kind of generally. Let me get back to that in 10 minutes or so. because I'm going to come to a way where I think it can be beneficial, but it's got some huge caveats next to it of things that you have to avoid in the process. Give me 10, 15 minutes maybe. All right. Last part is often people will point out this, say, well, look, if the firm makes exorbitant profits, why can't they just pay them out of some of the profits? And usually the way this goes, they're like, look, cost of a Nike sneaker, $90, and then how much do they pay the worker to assemble it? And there's no exorbitant profits to just give the workers extra. The companies might be profitable, but first, one, in terms of exorbitant, forget this current downturn, but generally, do you think of textile and apparel companies as the big growth and highly profitable ones? Not particularly. But aside from that, the real point is, from a firm's perspective, they don't care whether they have on net profits or not. They can care about on the margin what's contributing to profits. So even if they're making profits, if we do something that mandates them paying the workers more than their marginal revenue product there, it pulls down their total profit and makes them not want to employ those workers. So it doesn't matter if on net the firm's profitable and has money that, quote, they could do it. Look at what are the goals of the firm. The firm won't do it once it's costing them money to. All right, let's go on. So, anti-sweatshop movement, it's kind of an interesting mix. You get celebrities, ministers, student groups, labor unions, some misguided academics. Major players in it, Unite, National Labor Committee, and maybe more relevant to some of you, Students Against Sweatshop Labor. So United and National Labor Committee are unions that have been very vocal in this. United Students Against Sweatshop Labor started in '96, I believe, at Duke University and spread and has groups on many campuses across the country. How many of you know if you have a Students Against Sweatshop Labor on your campus? About a half dozen, maybe 10 of you. I think there's different incentives going on here in the different groups. In the Unite and National Labor Committee, I think it's fairly straightforward. What's the job of a labor union? Raise the wages of their members, right? If a union is doing its job, that's what it does. It raises the wages of its members. I had the unique experience of being, I wasn't technically in the union, I was a dues-paying person, but not a member. When I worked at San Jose State, the California Faculty Association is a union of all of the California State University professors, and they took money out of my paycheck every month to, quote, represent me. Even now, I didn't pay the full member dues, I just paid the agency fee because I didn't want to be supposedly that was parsing out what they used for political purposes. Of course it wasn't. But they were taking their agency fee to represent me in bargaining. They like to argue for harmonization of wages across campuses and harmonization of wages across disciplines. I'm an economist in Silicon Valley, and I need to be paid like a poetry professor in Fresno. What? It was actually a union who argued against my interest. It wasn't wage. Anyway, the usual point is unions are supposed to be raising the wages of their workers. How many third world workers are members of Unite? So why do unions say we have to mandate higher wages for sweatshops? If their work, are they just altruistic groups and like, hey, it's whole worker solidarity thing, man, we got to help those guys in the other country, get them higher wages because they're workers too? Now, what are they supposed to be doing?
Because if they increase the price of goods coming in, then their unions will be able to increase their compensation here as well.
Yeah, their competition is third world workers. If you're a garment worker in the United States, the garment workers in Guatemala are your competition. If you can do something that raises the cost of your competition, you're likely to get more of the benefit, more of the business to you, and higher wages for your union then. It's in their self-interest to do this. It's what the union is supposed to do is raise the members of its workers, and when they lobby for this, they're lobbying for international restrictions on working conditions or higher pay or whatever. It's things that price their competition out of the market and increase the demand for their workers, which they can raise their own wages. Now, it's fine if they want to make that argument, but they don't. What they say is we're trying to help third world workers, and we're helping them by doing this. Plain lie. They're trying to unemploy people who are much poorer than them so that they can raise their wages a little bit. I think it's rather despicable, actually. United Students Against Sweatshops, I don't think has any of that going on. For the most part, these people I've talked to are pretty well-meaning students who have very little economic knowledge. But they genuinely want to help third world workers, but really haven't bothered to understand the economics of it very much. And occasionally some of them have kind of good ideas, and I'll say that group has got better over time in terms of things that it advocates. I'll get into a couple of them later. things that they call for, so international labor standards, so these are like health, safety conditions and other things. Minimum and, quote, living wages, so mandated wages for the employees. I put right to organize in question marks, because it's the right to organize, and in a sense, I believe in the right to organize. If you guys want to get together and say, hey man, we're going to collectively bargain against, sweatshop jerk over here, and we're going to try to get higher wages, we all agree, we'll go in, we'll make them a take it or nothing offer for all of us. Cool, that's a right to organize. You organize yourself, you went and you made an offer. But when they say right to organize, what they mean is the right for the four of you to get together and say, we're going to collectively bargain, and say it's a 5-person firm, and he's like, no, I don't want to. Oh no, we formed a union actually, and you have to be part of it. So it means like forced grouping of people. I don't call that a right. So I'm opposed to that. But probably the worst thing that they advocate. What's the worst thing you could advocate to help sweatshop workers? Trade barriers is one. Closing sweatshops is another version. How about just as a consumer?
Not buy it.
Boycott. Let's not buy their stuff. So here's one of them I saw from a campus, and it's kind of interesting. They got all sorts of warm, fuzzy stuff on here. But it's boycott the Gap and Old Navy stores, but also stop liquidation logging is up there too. Celebrate the Redwood Forest is in there, but they've got sweatshops throughout the thing. They're opposing sweatshops there. Another one, boycott Nike because of this. When you do a boycott, it means you stop buying the products. So it's in the stores now. What do the stores do when you stop buying the product?
Stop making them.
Well, before they stop making them, what month is it now? God, it's June. What happened to the price of winter coats in the stores? Sale. Drop the price, right? So we start dropping the price of the stuff that sweatshop workers make to try to get rid of it. Let's think back. What determines wages? Upper and lower bound, right? Upper bound is marginal revenue product. How much revenue they create for the firm. When the price of the product falls, what happens to their marginal revenue product? It falls too. Doesn't matter. They're in there stitching the shoe just the same as they were before. Nothing physical changed about this worker. But now, because the product that they're producing is less valuable to you, it justifies less pay for them. So this means firms start cutting back on terms, if they're going to keep employing them, the upper bound is decreased, or they simply stop making the stuff and they close. So the Oxfam example was when people protested the child labor there and they're under pressure to get rid of them, they just fired them, closed down. Boycott's a particularly nasty thing to do. I mean, if we care about the welfare of these people, the worst thing you can do is do something that lowers their upper bound. But that's precisely what boycotts do. I will say I'm embarrassed to admit that there are some economists who have protested sweatshops. And that's actually what got me into it as a research question. Because most of the stuff I've been saying so far, other economists have talked about, but they haven't really researched it the same way. And it's this group here called Scholars Against Sweatshop Labor. Over 400 guys signed this thing. 73% of them were economists. To some extent, it was the usual suspects, like the last bastions of Marxist economics. So UMass, Notre Dame, the New School. I'd expect that from them. Also, though, some guys at Harvard and Berkeley are on it. Some particularly notable people, one Nobel Prize winner, a couple former labor secretaries. And they circulated a letter in support of campus anti-sweatshop movements. Basically, it was in response. A previous letter had circulated by international trade economists. The international trade economists were all saying to their universities, don't do these things to ban sweatshop products in your stores. It's going to harm the workers. And these guys wrote a letter in response, and one of the things that they said in it is they pointed out that the trade economists, what they had said is that multinational corporations pay more than domestic firms in third world countries. And these other economists recognized that and said, yeah, that's true, multinationals do tend to pay more. However, that doesn't speak to sweatshop conditions. Most garments made in sweatshops aren't made by multinational corporations. They're made by domestic subcontractors. It's somebody else who owns the firm, makes the product to the specifications of the corporation, and then sells it. So when it's the Boycott, the Gap, or the Old Navy, those aren't literally the ones having them make it, nor is the main clothing line. It's some domestic subcontractor who makes it and passes it on. So they simply said, you don't have the evidence to support this. That's basically what they're saying down here. So that's what got me interested in this. I said, okay, well, let's take a look then and see what are the wages actually in the sweatshops that are the domestic subcontractors. So how do you go about doing this? So I gave you a definition of sweatshop before when I started what type of sweatshops I'm talking about. But when I go out to the world to pick out what a sweatshop is, there's going to be a problem if I pick them out and then I show you that sweatshop workers earn more money than non-sweatshop workers. what are people going to say to me? What? Those aren't sweatshops. What you picked out weren't really bad sweatshops. You picked out just garment factories in the third world. So I had to figure out how to deal with this. The obvious thing to me was use the definition of my opponents. So we went into the US news sources, and we looked from the mid-90s till about 2001, 2002 when I started working on this project. Did it with a guy, Dave Scarbeck, who's a grad student now. He was an undergrad at the time. And we documented every case that we could find in US news sources of a protest of some group saying something else was a sweatshop. So they said this company was a sweatshop in whatever country. And we used every article that we could find like that, where they also said what the wages were. So we had a list of countries where sweatshops supposedly exist, and then we had a list of wages. So the first thing we did, just with the list of countries, apparel industry is the biggest user of sweatshops, typically. So we said, what's our list of countries where they say sweatshops are? Let's look at the apparel industry in those countries. So that's the first thing we did. And this is the average hourly wage in US dollars in the list of countries where we could get both accusation of sweatshop and the apparel industry earnings in that country. And you see it's very low by US standards. The poorest there is Bangladesh at about 13 cents an hour. The highest is Costa Rica at $2.38. In general, you see Latin American countries that pop up tend to get paid more than the Asian countries. So that's the comparison most people make, and they stop there and they just say, look how poor the country is, how bad the wages are compared to us. What we did then is we said, well, let's compare it actually to average national income in these countries. So compare it to the other jobs on average that are available. So this line here is 100% of GDP. So if you earned enough to hit that line, that means working in the apparel industry, you earn the exact same as the average income in the economy. We had to do it for 40, 50, 60, 70-hour estimates because we didn't have a number of hours per week that the workers worked. There was no data on that, so we just threw those in. In practice, the 40-hour one's pretty irrelevant because one of the characteristics of a sweatshop is working long hours. In fact, a lot of the articles we found had quotes on them of how long the workers worked, and in only one case was it less than 60 hours per week. So it was always very long ones. So it's really the 60 and 70 hours that's probably more relevant. What we're finding, though, in every one of these countries, at the longer hours, you earn at least the average income working in the apparel industry. But compared to that, take some of these, like Nicaragua and Honduras. You're hitting like 7 times national income. It's not just better than the alternative, it's vastly better than what the alternative is. And even then, even if you were at the 100% line, keep in mind what's relevant. It's the best available opportunity for that worker. So half of your jobs in your economy have to be below average. So this is just asking, are they above average for everybody? Even if someone is a below average job, it could still be good for them. Yeah?
Where can I find that graph?
Right here.
I'm saying, is there any way to find it online?
Yeah. You could get it off my website. Just Google me and you can find me. It's pretty easy. But it was published, the research article that the stuff's based on was in Journal of Labor Research a few years back maybe. And it's got the same title as the presentation, Sweatshop Wages of Third World Workers, Are the Jobs Worth the Sweat? Yeah.
Just quickly, the 100% represents what again?
Average income in the country.
Oh,
So-
average income in the
in the
not
country.
just in that industry.
Not in that industry. So make this the United States. This line would be like $40,000 per capita.
Oh, okay.
So if you have a job that's more than $40,000 in the apparel industry, you'd be above the line. If your job was less, you'd be below the line. And this is telling you 2 times average, 3 times that. So when you're getting up here to like 5 times average, this would be like us saying a bad job in the United States pays $200,000. It's insane compared to the relative alternatives. So the first part, the point is you shouldn't even have to have this bar because it just means the worker's in the best job for them, and some people are going to be below average. But the point is these things in the apparel industry are not just good for that worker, but compared to what everybody else is doing, way better in most of these countries. We can also compare it to more dire poverty. So the World Bank uses the $1 and $2 a day threshold for how many people are in extreme poverty. And you look at this list of countries, significant chunks of the population are well below $2 per day, and pretty big chunks are still below $1 a day in a lot of these countries. So we can compare what would the apparel industry earnings be in a country where you got people who are this dire poverty. What you end up with, 9 out of the 10 countries working 10 hours a day in the sweatshop, get you above the $2 threshold. The only place where that's not true is Bangladesh, where it was the 13 cents an hour. And even there, 36% of the population doesn't make it over that level, and less than 30% doesn't achieve even that. And only 1 out of 5 people in the country does make it over the $2. So compared to the extreme poverty, it's pretty good. So the next thing we do is we start looking at the actual protested sweatshops themselves. So apparel industry in the protested countries, cool, that's one measure. But now let's look at like the worst of the worst, the particular ones where you said this is a sweatshop worker. So from that, we use the LexisNexis search engine to search the US popular news sources. The data literally often comes from the protesters themselves. It'll be somebody said this worker's earning only X. If anything, this data is going to have a bias against what I want to say. If you're someone protesting a sweatshop and you want to say how bad it is, your incentive would be to understate earnings or to pick the very newest worker at that sweatshop, the very least paid one. So to the extent that I can show they're still good, it's really kind of started stacked against me. Because some other problems with it, since it's coming from news sources, I don't know what exchange rates people are using, so there's a little bit of inconsistency across the data. So we shouldn't worry too much about little fine differences, but overall we're looking for the big picture on this. This is the face of sweatshop employers. So we actually had a list of different companies that were benefiting from the Sweatshop Labor, and Mary Kate and Ashley were in on it, Walmart. And I thought that was P. Diddy, but someone told me it's not. It's 50 cents. Apparently 50 cent pays his workers more than 50 cents. So this is the different cases that we found. So each individual observation would be a particular case in a country. So we had 3 from Bangladesh. A couple of them were Mary Kate and Ashley. A whole bunch from China. Sometimes we didn't have a firm associated. Like I said, they're from domestic subcontractors, and sometimes they didn't know where it was eventually going to. The gaps in there, it continues. See, there's P. Diddy up near the top. He was in Haiti. Kathy Lee Gifford, the famous case there where she cried when she was confronted on TV with a worker from one of her firms. If I ever do a book on this, there's going to be a chapter called Don't Cry for Me, Kathy Lee. Nike's got a whole bunch of the examples in Indonesia. Anyway, you can see the pay on each of these. Sometimes they're quoted in daily rates, sometimes they're quoted in hourly rates, sometimes monthly. So what we did is we started aggregating all of these to come up with a measure of sweatshop wages in these different countries. So this is kind of a mouthful, but it makes sense. Well, we have all those different ones. What we have to do is then average the sweatshop wages together. So say we have 7 examples from Indonesia. We take an average of all of those to get a measure of average sweatshop earnings in the country. And then we're going to do just like we did before and compare it to average incomes. But since we got different years here, we just have to average incomes. That's the mouthful part. It just means if I have 2 cases from 97 and 1 from 99, when I create that average to compare to, I have to use income 97, income 97, income 99 divided by 3. And now I can compare apples to apples when I'm doing the comparison. So what do we end up finding? Less dramatic than when we do the apparel industry, but same story overall. Here's our 100% line now. Every time working at these sweatshops gets you over that, means we're earning more than the average income in the country in the very sweatshops that are popping up in U.S. news sources. So Bangladesh, despite that very low figure, up over 100% average there. Cambodia, there's not the separate estimates because we only had weekly reports from Cambodia, so we just multiplied by 52 and could use that. China, lower. China didn't reach up to it. And part of my suspicion on China is we said we were not dealing with cases of coerced labor. In some cases, we found coerced labor for China, and we didn't include that in our data. It was literally slave labor. In other cases of China, just the wording of the article didn't make it clear. And some of that might have creeped in, and to the extent that you can force workers to work for you, you obviously don't have to pay them better than their alternatives, or you obviously aren't paying them better than their alternatives. So maybe some of that slipped into there. I don't know. Costa Rica, Dominican, El Salvador were pretty close to it. Haiti, Honduras, again, way up above average. Indonesia, just barely getting up there. Good reason for that in Indonesia. Almost all the examples from Indonesia were Nike, but in one of the articles I found that they said they also provide free lunches to their employees. So like, oh, that's another form of compensation that was systematically there that doesn't show up in wages. But I don't know how to value that, so it has to stay out of here. Nicaragua, way over. Vietnam, over. When we compare it to the abject poverty, again, this is the same table I showed you before. We have 45 individual cases of sweatshop reports. 43 of those resulted in earning more than $1 a day. And over half of them got you above the $2 a day threshold. So our standard measures for extreme poverty in these countries. Well, big chunks of the population didn't. So, this cartoonist thought it was funny to have the sweatshop and have the small-brained employer saying, look on the bright side, no one will ever mug you for your pay. The reality is, if you're going to mug someone in these countries, it's the sweatshop workers you should probably mug. So, what one thing on the margin could maybe be done? So this is an Air sweatshop. I'm a fan of Air sweatshops. This Nike allows you to stitch things into your, have a custom stitching in your shoe, and somebody thought this was funny. They probably didn't like sweatshops. I actually like it as a good example for one thing on the margin that you can do. So Michael Jordan is an employee of Nike, right? Does he stitch shoes for him? But Nike pays him a ton. Why does Nike pay him a ton?
Because he's scarce.
He is scarce, but lots of things are scarce they don't pay. Because of what? Who said that?
He's highly valued. His opinion counts to a lot of people.
His opinion counts to a lot of people. His advertisement counts to people, right? Or to use the generic, we all want to be like Mike. So Mike endorses it, you want to wear the shoes. It creates value in your head. Remember, value is subjective. We talked about this in earlier lectures. So because of Michael Jordan's endorsement, it makes you value the product more, you're willing to pay more for it. Michael Jordan's now a production worker for Nike. He's creating value for you the same way people who stitch the sneakers are creating value for you. Why would Air Sweatshop be cool? If they come out with a brand that is, this is produced in third world countries and you should value Air Sweatshops, and you start actually wanting to buy sweatshop sneakers more, that sweatshop worker, precisely because they're a sweatshop worker, is creating additional value in your mind. What just happened to one of the bounds? Upper bound just bounced up, right? Because you're valuing that, even though they stitch just the same, they're creating something more valuable specifically because it comes from them. So just having Michael Jordan endorse it more doesn't help. The company won't pay the worker more for that. But they would pay the worker more, the upper bound would go up, if you value it specifically because of that worker. So I think ethical branding, so this kind of gets to the question you were popping up earlier. Ethical branding is one thing that you can do. So to the extent that demands from consumers say, we wish those workers were paid better, and we'd like to see branding on the sneaker that shows that the workers paid better, and we're willing to pay more for the product because of it, can help the workers on the margin. That's something that would pull up that upper bound. But we have to be very careful when we say the ethical branding thing. Because if it comes in of saying, we're going to put ethical branding on it, and then we're going to impose the standard and say companies must pay the workers more, that would mean that everybody, for it to work, everybody in society would also have to be willing to pay more for the shoes. Basically, it would have to create subjective value for everybody who buys the product. Is that likely? No. It's a particular demand that you can foster with this, but it's got to be for those people who it does create additional value for. And even for them, another caveat, you have to buy in the same quantity as before. So like the fair trade coffee people or whatever, if someone's like, oh, I'm going to buy fair trade coffee instead of the other coffee. But because it costs a little bit more, I'm going to only buy 1 cup a day instead of 2 cups a day. On net, you're probably harming people. So is the case that maybe, it might be the case actually, because there's a lot of problem with fair trade branding, it might be the case that you're helping the person that produced the coffee that you're drinking, but it is the case since your total demand for coffee in general went down to some other coffee worker somewhere else who's paid less or is unemployed. So with the ethical branding thing, it can be a voluntary mechanism, and people can push for it as long as they buy in the same quantity and they make sure it's just voluntary. In that sense, we can do something to raise their upper bound with nothing physical changing about them or the government's policies. So the real cure, though, so that's like a very small aspect of this. Oh, and for the other thing, for student activists, useful thing for them to do would be to actually monitor ethical branding. So there's different agencies out there that will kind of give their seal of approval of, yes, this is actually a more ethical product than some of the other ones. For student activists, if they want to do something about this, create nonprofits that go around and monitor this and help certify it so that it's more reliable, so you don't have some of the problems that you do with, quote, fair trade coffees or whatever, where it's actually really mostly a sham. So there's some of that going on, but there could be more of that profitably done. But this has to be a business decision for companies, too. They have to feel that there's the market demand for it. That's why it has to be voluntary. Individual companies can use it as a competitive mechanism of competition. The real answer, though, is the process of development. Sweatshops aren't new. Had them in the UK, had them in the United States, have them in every developed country. What happens is they form as your incomes rise, as your productivity increases, your incomes rise. As your incomes rise, working conditions improve, sweatshops disappear. Child labor virtually disappears as you become close to upper or lower income countries. People don't force children to work because they're mean. They force children to work, or they make children choose to work because they're desperately poor and they won't survive otherwise. All of this is cured by things that bring that upper bound up. In fact, I'm optimistic about how quick this process can work now. So think about the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain and the United States. How long did that take to bring people from what was an agricultural society to one that gets past sweatshop conditions? About 100 years, maybe a little bit longer. All of you are probably too young for this. But do you remember, or have you heard it, when made in Hong Kong or made in Taiwan was like a joke?
Yeah.
That's not the case now. But those were sweatshop countries. Post-World War II, those were precisely the type of places that I was talking about here, where there were apparel producers and low-quality products in sweatshop-style factories. Did it take 100 years for them to virtually... They're not on my list. I didn't find a single case of a protested sweatshop in those countries. What happened? Big growth. Virtually generation and a half, sweatshops popped up, sweatshops disappeared. They moved on. They grew quick. I'll take questions at the end. I'm getting the sign that I need to be starting to wrap up. Happened much quicker there. Look at the places who are starting to change their economic freedom and get their institutions right today. The growth in China, the growth in India, even more magnificent than what was happening then. Why is this the case? When we first were doing it, all the capital and all the technology had to be created anew. It was a slower process. The longer you remain poor, the more rapid your catch-up can be. So these countries that are behind today, they benefit from the capital stock that's already out there in the technology. Once they get their institutions right, foreign investment comes in, and you don't have just Reebok. You have Reebok versus Nike, then somebody else. And as capital comes in, the labor becomes more productive. So the process of development can happen much quicker in these countries. But it's a process. It's not an instant magic bullet. You can't skip the process. So increasing labor productivity is the technology, the know-how, the physical capital that matches with the worker, and improvements of the human capital. All of these are part of the process of development, part of the sweatshop process. The sweatshops themselves bring capital to those countries, physical capital and technology of new ways of doing things. Workers who work in them start to build human capital that's different than what they had before. So this is the process working. These other things, leisure, comforts, child leisure, safety, these are all normal goods. As they start getting more productive, they'll buy more of them. The tragedy is that policies that risk raising compensation above their level of productivity for their firm cut the whole process short. So you don't end up getting that sustained development. The real problem in lots of these places is that the institutions that are there don't encourage the long-term process of growth. In fact, the reason worker productivity is so low quite often is because bad political institutions there. Lack of economic freedom. So it's not that the physical worker can't even produce more, it's that because the government taxes so much of it, because you have to pay so many bribes and corruption to get the product out of the country or to get your license, that all of these costs factor into how much revenue that worker can create for your firm, that their productivity is lower because of all of these institutional policies. Or for that matter, the risk of even doing business there. If you're worried about the nationalization of your business, about the exchange rate changing because of high and variable inflation, all of these things when you're doing your because it's really not literally the value they contribute, it's the expected value they contribute, you become more uncertain about it and risk averse, and you won't be able to pay them as much. So all of those things artificially lower the productivity of the workers. We wanted to give them a big boost right away. Their countries could boost it by improving their domestic policies. So in the interim, until that happens, I already said that. Okay. What am I doing here? So conclusions from this, basically, what the research I was illustrating was that compared to domestic alternatives, these jobs are much better than most of the other alternatives that they face. The wages are low for basic economic reasons because productivity low and opportunities are limited. The way to fix these is to give them more opportunities and greater growth. Unfortunately, I think a lot of the activity that the anti-sweatshop movement does cuts this very process short and makes the workers worse off both in the short run and the long run. The real game is institutional reform in the third world, getting better economic freedom there. Unfortunately, as I was talking about last lecture, I don't think this is something we can do very much of from the outside. From the U.S. perspective, while we could do things that would marginally help them, like give them freer trade and access to the United States market, we're kind of limited when it comes to the institutional reforms. We're not very good at exporting institutions of capitalism at the point of a gun. So in the interim, until they improve their institutions, and you should too. So with that, I'll open it up for questions. Yeah.
Just a little side thing. I go to school at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana, and there was a huge movement this past semester to get rid of Coke on campus because there was a new, I guess the contract was being up for renewal, and so there's the Republicans that were, the Republican group on campus was trying to keep Coke on campus because there was this thing where there was something that went on in, I guess, some Coke sweatshop in some other far-off country, and where there was a worker that was supposedly abused, but we don't really even know. And just to show the ignorance of the anti-sweatshop students, they didn't realize that there was a big Coke bottling facility in Bloomington itself, and so all the Coke we were getting was pretty much from that bottling facility in the town that was employing most of the people. So if we had got rid of Coke on campus, it just would have destroyed the people that lived in Bloomington, the actual residents. So it just, I don't know, it just shows a lot of ignorance that the opposition has.
Okay. Other questions? Yes.
Some people might argue for that there's a problem with asymmetric information in sweatshops. So like if I'm a sweatshop worker and I decide to be in this sweatshop and that sweatshop and this one pays more, but what I don't know and what the employer knows is that that he hasn't updated sewing machines, so there's a high probability of my fingers being cut off in this one and that one.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that there's not really a good way to address that, but a lot of people would raise that issue, but how do you address that?
Yeah, so the question is asymmetric information, where employers know about the safety of their equipment and workers don't. They might know that it's higher wages at one place or another, but they don't know about the other job characteristics. Certainly, there's a problem of that, but I think it's fairly limited in scope because you adaptively learn it. So unless you injure yourself very quickly on the job there, you start seeing what happens to workers on average there, and then you can make an informed decision of whether you want to stay or leave. So I think the error correction process is fairly robust. Even still, if it's a firm operating in a particular area, the workers likely intermingle, so you'll have knowledge about this anyway going in. If it's a new firm opening up, it's probably more problematic. But I think it's learned fairly quickly. Aside from all of that, if you think it's a systematic problem that's not being corrected like that, there could be scope for a nonprofit to go in and monitor, or for that matter, a for-profit who monitors and sells their information, but not to use it to regulate, just to say, hey, workers, this is the rate of injury at this firm. Just publicize it. That could be an activist who is very concerned about that particular issue. Go do it and see if it actually starts improving workers. It might be that you're wasting your time because the error correction process has done 99% of the work anyway. Yeah?
Some developing countries are trying to move their child laborers back into the education sector. Like India, they've allowed education to be free. Do you think countries should try, and governments should try to move their child laborers back to education, or allow them to work?
They shouldn't discourage them from moving to education. They should certainly allow them to work. I wouldn't say that they should try to move it. When the incentive to get education is there and the means are, people tend to choose it themselves. So they can't provide their education for, quote, free. The resources have to come from somewhere. And if they're providing more education for free, that means they have to be taxing it from other workers who are desperately poor. And I don't see that as a net benefit. People will get the education once they can afford to not work and there's actually a return on investment. In a lot of these countries, the return on investment in education is fairly bad. Also, the other thing I got to say about education, everybody around here, well, it's Foundation for Economic Education, so of course we like education. I like education. But when we think about the basic education that people are getting in third world countries, as well as even the United States, we can think about private, good human capital education, and then public good human capital education. So the stuff like math, English, accounting, those are basically skills that you're earning that are going to make you more productive, you're going to get the return from. The other things that are public good education, the reason would be you want them to be educated so they can make more informed decisions as voters. I've already told you about the whole mess of that anyway. But aside from that, let's think about the public good education that people receive when the government provides it to them. History, civics. What type of public good education is being taught in most of these countries? Propaganda that supports the government. So they're doing public bad education. So I don't really want to see more people go into that anyway. Way in the back, yeah.
So, I mean, I guess this is like a question, but I guess you're saying in a different manner. One thing that I think empirical social science education, especially in terms of law and social movements,
Louder.
in terms of law and social movements, some of the evidence has shown through the years is that when you have a polarized issue and you triangulate the issue, you're able to create some movement even if you advocate for larger movement, right? So I guess an example that I learned in one of my past classes is that some environmentalists argue for really, really heavy state regulation of emissions from cars, right? But that causes auto companies to advocate for the federalization of auto emissions because it won't be as extreme as state emissions regulations. So in that sense, would it be smart for student organizations or whatever to advocate for really, really strong worker rights, even if they realize that that would hurt the workers in the long run because of due to the polarization of the issue?
Right, got it. So the question is, by pushing for something a lot more stringent, might you get a marginal improvement, and then maybe they should just push for something more extreme in order to get that marginal improvement, basically.
Sure, I mean, even in Congress, there's obviously pro-business groups and pro-labor groups.
Got it. Yeah, so by creating the polarization, you get the marginal change. So the presumption of that, though, is that the marginal change would be in the right direction. So if the marginal change should be 0, and we push for something extreme to get something greater than 0, that's a move in the wrong direction. So I don't know what it would mean to be a marginal move in restrictions on how firms compete to hire workers in the third world. So a marginal, just a small increase in a minimum wage or a living wage there, a small change in the mix of compensation, all of those would be bad. So I don't see that as the case. The best interpretation I could have for anything on that is that by talking about sweatshops a lot, more people become concerned with it and start doing some of the ethical branding stuff. But for the most part, they're producing ignorance about the issue that I think more than offsets that and is more likely to harm the workers. Yeah.
So apart from the ethical branding, your perspective is essentially that it should be left to the free market, right?
Yes. I had one of those before when someone asked a similar question. Yeah, in this case it's...
Is there anything else that you feel would be a good direction to move in with regards to sweatshops?
The problem in these countries is they don't have free markets. So in particular abuses, when I could say it's a particular sweatshop, sometime I'd say that it might be a grant of government privilege to a company to operate, so they might make a contract where it's only Nike, and I don't mean Nike in specific in this case, but just a firm in general, can operate in this city. Now we've outlawed the process of competition so that the gap between marginal revenue that the worker creates and opportunity costs can be bigger because other people aren't free to come in and compete and push the wages up. So in that case, it would be a restriction on the market that's there that makes sweatshop conditions worse than they are. And what we should be is abolishing such exclusive grants of privilege to companies. So things like that, things that induce competition, we should be pushing for. Yeah.
I have a question. Can we go back to your conclusion slide?
Possibly.
Your second one is wages are low because productivity is low. Can you explain that? Because when you had the apparel slide, I mean, most of them were these huge companies that were employing, like Nike, and you were mentioning Reebok, and those are not small productivity companies. So what do you mean by...
Yeah, so the company overall is not small productivity. The productivity of the amount of revenue that's created from the workers in that country is very small. So productivity is about that country and the worker, and in particular, those workers there, how much value they create. And the value they create is very small. So this is when I was talking about the upper bound. Basically, productivity is a different word for upper bound. And it is the case that Nike sells shoes for a lot of money and makes a profit. But they have all sorts of other things that go into their cost too that aren't just that both go into their cost and that create that value that have nothing to do with that worker. So like Michael Jordan is one of the costs of Nike sneakers that creates subjective value in people's head. We also have to worry about part of the reason their productivity is low there is because of those institutional barriers that prevent you from getting the full benefit out of their labor. Things like tax rates that the government takes instead of being gains from trade between the workers and the firm. That's something that limits the productivity. The probability that they might have a currency devaluation and that could screw up your business relations. You have to worry about that so your expected productivity is lower. All those type of things. So it's not literally that the company itself isn't a, quote, big company. It's the amount of revenue that can be generated from that place. Yeah?
You talked about the effect that sweatshops have on the countries that they're located in. But I'm curious if sweatshops were to be closed, I mean, obviously it would increase prices, but what other effects might it have on jobs and on the United States?
Uh-huh. So if it was just generally, if they were closed, it would boost demand for apparel workers in the United States. That's why the apparel workers unions in the United States like this idea. More generally, they're not going to, quote, abolish sweatshops. They might put in a minimum work standard, minimum working standards, core labor standards, or they might put in a minimum living wage. What would that do? It would close down sweatshops in some countries and it would benefit others. So remember when I showed you average apparel industry earnings between the different countries, and I said something along the lines of the Asian countries tend to be lower, the Latin American countries tend to be in the $1 to $2 range. If all of a sudden they went in and they put a minimum standard on, say, a U.S. trade agreement that says all garments coming in, workers must have been paid at least $1 an hour, what would happen in this case? Tons of those Asian sweatshops would close. There'd be new demand for the Latin American sweatshops that would push wages up in Latin America, and those workers would be better off as a result. But keep in mind, if we're really concerned about the poor, we're taking the poorer sweatshop workers, impoverishing them, for the relatively less poor sweatshop workers and making them better off. So you'd get sectoral switch with those type of regulations.
So you don't think there would be much net effect on the actual United States, the money would just be shifted outside?
There'd be some net effect. So there's a reason why it's distributed the way that it is now with the labor there versus in Asia versus Latin America and the different countries. So if we're tending towards and approximating some sort of an equilibrium in that, something that changed it, that raised the cost of employing the third world workers, and it ended up being a shift from Asia to Latin America, say, well, obviously that's not the most profitable shift, because otherwise they would have already done it. So that's happened now. And when that happens, overall costs go up, which means on the margin, we still make some garments in the United States. There'd be some increase in the United States. I don't know how big the magnitude would be. I can't estimate that. But the point being, all decisions are made on the margin. So it would have some marginal increase in demand in the United States. Yeah?
What about the migration of some of these companies like Nike, who used to build shoes in China, Hong Kong, and they're centralized in Indonesia now?
Mm-hmm.
Do they work themselves out of these positions because they're creating this work which is raising wages, or is it typically more often policy and regulations which force them out of one nation into another?
So it's both. And I don't want to say on average one more than the other in the short run. In the long run, so the question was, companies switch between different countries over time. Is that due to the companies being successful themselves, basically, or is it due to policy shifts in the different countries? The answer is both, and I think it's both in the short run, but it's predominantly the companies work themselves out of it in the long run. So what's happening is, for these type of goods to be produced, you don't want to be using high-cost labor. You want low-opportunity cost labor to produce these goods, which means as you locate, say, when it started out, when made in Hong Kong or made in Taiwan was a joke, it was low-cost labor there that's most efficient, comparative advantage, back to Tony's lecture. Their comparative advantage was producing garments. As they earned more money, built more skills, got more education, more physical capital there, their comparative advantage was no longer producing garments. Their comparative advantage was producing technology. So they start doing that, which means the sweatshop has to leave and go locate somewhere else, and that's how it's migrated there. The long-term process, I think, is completely that. In the short run, there could be lots of changes in policy that make a company bail from one country or run to another. These could be good changes, they could be bad changes, both on the giving and receiving end. So the country that it's in might make its policies worse. The company just says, the heck with it, I'm out of here. It also could be that the country you're going to, its policies became better, so you went there. It also could be their policy became worse from a general interest standpoint, but better for you. So they just decide they're going to subsidize the company to come there, which is not good. So it could be any of those. But the long run, I think it's the sweatshops working themselves out. Yeah?
If you were to redo or do a follow-up research on this,
Yep.
what would you
Different avenue, and funny that you ask, I'm doing one right now. We're doing a specific country study, so we're working in Guatemala. And what we're doing there is, since I encounter this debate all the time about working conditions versus wages, and despite the fact of talking about how they're linked, what I wanted to do was get evidence on the working conditions in particular. So I took a list of companies from the National Labor Committee of places that they protested as sweatshops in Guatemala. So it's their own definitions again. And created a survey for the workers there that asked them about what are the working conditions like there. But it also asked them what were the working conditions like in your last job, basically, to look at have they moved from a condition where they had longer hours, crappier pay, less health and safety, to one where they have more, even though they're in this thing that's being called a sweatshop. So we survey there's roughly about 20 questions or so that we put in there, all relative to working conditions, looking at the frequency of the problems and how it improved. The other thing that we asked them in there, and this cuts right to the mix of compensation, which I think is great, is after we establish how much, how likely is it you get injured, things like that, how much of your pay would you be willing to give up to, and then I have the list of things, work fewer hours, have longer lunch breaks, etc., a whole bunch of those things. And each time we're asking them how much of their pay they'd be willing to give up to get that. So we're trying to get what their trade-offs are, and I think the answer is going to be overwhelmingly none on average, but there'll be individual variations. So that's the follow-up research that I think addresses what some of the people have debated.
When will that be done?
If one of my coworkers on the project was more cooperative, it would be done right now. I was planning on writing up the results this month. The problem is actually getting the survey conducted. So the survey's written, and I have a local co-author down there who needs to get out and actually hand them out and survey the workers. And
Do you know how many workers you're going to survey, or like what percentage it'll be?
As many as we can. What I requested that we didn't do on it is I didn't want to get the company's permission and go in and meet with the workers, because I don't want the workers to feel coerced to say good things about the company. So what I was suggesting was employing some low-cost laborers to help us out and basically hand them out as the workers are leaving the factory a few days in a row and try to get everybody. And, as higher percentages we can get doing it like that. We'll see. And in the case of how big are these firms, there are a few hundred people at them. There were like 4 or 5 firms that I identified there. It looks like 2 are going to be actually surveyable. Some of the other ones have already closed. But we got 400 or 500 workers there. Should be interesting. All right, I got time. 2 more questions and 2 more hands. Perfect. Go.
Okay, would you advocate ending the labor standards in the United States on the basis of allowing for whatever?
Yeah, tomorrow. Today. Yesterday. Gone. So, but don't. The question was, would I advocate getting rid of the labor standards in the United States today? When I just distinguished the government imposed labor standards, yeah, we don't need them. Quite frankly, would have basically the same levels of standards anyway, because of the competition in the marketplace and what our demands for the mix of compensation would be. A different study that you could look at on this, it was called "Bad for the Goose, Bad for the Gander." By a guy named Peter Leeson, and it looked at when the United States put in different labor regulations and health and safety standards and what our level of GDP was there. And his point in the article wasn't so much that it was bad for us at that time, but that mostly it was irrelevant for us by that time, because we had already grown past a standard like that, so it was more okay to adopt it. And then he did this. Then he took that and did a comparison with other countries today, what their standards of living are, and was like, how long would it take them at a minimum to be safe to adopt some regulation the U.S. did in the past? And he finds, decades of growth for these countries before they should have similar legislation. An interesting example, by the way, on minimum wage, when people point out minimum wage doesn't really unemploy many workers. And of course, it doesn't really unemploy that many, because they're putting the minimum wage always at something darn near where the market minimum would have been anyway. They're just bumping it up a little bit. So when you look for unemployment, you usually have to look at unskilled workers, particularly minority youths, to see much of an effect. However, when the United States first adopted they weren't very careful with the language. They adopted one for all of the United States, including the U.S. territories. And while they adopted one that was not going to have a huge effect on U.S. wages, because Puerto Rico was so much poorer, there was massive unemployment that popped up in Puerto Rico on it. Okay, you have the last question now.
I was actually going to bring up that about Leeson's article, but what I was going to ask you is, what about the issue of literacy as far as the survey is concerned? Are you running across any problems there?
I don't anticipate any, because we're just going to verbally ask them. I mean, we're going to literally stand there and survey them and do it. And it's going to be done in Spanish, too, so I don't anticipate problems. Anyway, I've really enjoyed spending this week or part of this week with all of you. I've enjoyed the questions. I actually got some new sweatshop questions today, which doesn't usually happen for me. And all of you should feel free, if there's things that I've brought up that you want to reference on later, feel free to email me. I'm easy to find on the web. Also, in particular, I haven't mentioned this yet, one of the reasons I like coming to these things is I like identifying good undergraduate students who are thinking of going to grad school for economics. Suffolk is one of the few places where you can pursue a kind of free market track in a PhD program. If you start hitting that stage, whether it's this year or years later, email me and I'd love to talk to you about the opportunities that we have there for people like you. So, thank you all.